There is a feeling that visits you when everything appears to be fine. You wake up, you go through the motions, you answer the questions, you smile when you are expected to smile. You continue carrying the life you have built. And yet somewhere beneath all of it, something is moving, something is whispering, something is unsettled, and you cannot quite give it a name. You may call it boredom, you may call it confusion. You may tell yourself that you are simply tired, that you need a vacation, a new distraction, another person, another achievement. But sometimes the feeling is not asking you to escape your life. Sometimes it is asking you to finally listen to it, because there are moments when the soul becomes restless before the mind understands why. You begin to feel uncomfortable in places that once felt familiar. Conversations that once entertained you suddenly feel empty. Things you once chased no longer seem to satisfy you. You find yourself staring into the distance, wondering why you feel as though something is missing when you cannot even identify what it is. And perhaps the most frightening part is that nothing is obviously wrong, but something is no longer right. Do not be so quick to silence that feeling. Do not rush to fill every quiet space with noise. Do not convince yourself that you are broken simply because you cannot explain what is happening inside you. There are seasons of life when the old version of you begins to loosen its grip before the new version has learned how to speak. That space can feel like restlessness. It can feel like loneliness. It can feel like uncertainty. But uncertainty is not always a warning. Sometimes it is an invitation. Maybe the life you have been living was necessary for who you were becoming, but it was never meant to be the final destination. Maybe you have outgrown certain expectations. Maybe you have spent too many years becoming what everyone else needed, and not enough time discovering what your own heart requires. And now something inside you is saying, quietly but firmly, there must be more than this. Listen, not because every feeling is an instruction, but because some feelings arrive carrying truths you have postponed for too long. You don't need to know exactly where you are going. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't need permission to admit that something inside you has changed. You only need enough courage to stop running from the question. What is this restlessness trying to tell me? Perhaps it is telling you to release something. Perhaps it is telling you to begin something. Perhaps it is telling you that you have been surviving when you were meant to be living. Whatever the answer is, let yourself become quiet enough to hear it, because sometimes the feeling you cannot explain is the first language of transformation. And perhaps what you have been calling restlessness is not the absence of peace at all, but the beginning of a deeper peace you have not yet learned how to recognize. There are moments in life when you can feel that something has changed, even when you cannot point to the exact moment it happened. Nothing around you may look different. The same room, the same responsibilities, the same people, the same routines may still be waiting for you each morning. Yet something inside you refuses to settle. You feel restless, distracted, distant, perhaps even strangely dissatisfied. You may wonder what is wrong with you. You may think you are ungrateful because you have things that others would be grateful to have. But sometimes restlessness is not proof that something is wrong with you. Sometimes it is evidence that a deeper part of you knows you cannot remain where you have been forever. There is a quiet intelligence within you that notices when your outer life and inner truth no longer agree. You can ignore that intelligence for a while, but you cannot erase it. You can bury it beneath work, entertainment, relationships, responsibilities, and endless distractions. You can tell yourself that you should be satisfied. You can remind yourself that you have already come so far. Still, that small voice remains. It asks you whether this is truly the life you want. It asks whether the dreams you once carried still belong to you. It asks whether you are choosing your life or simply repeating it. That is why restlessness can be so uncomfortable. It challenges the familiar. It disturbs the arrangement you have become accustomed to. It asks you to look at places where you have settled simply because settling was easier than changing. But change rarely begins with certainty. More often, it begins with discomfort. You may not know what you want next, but you know something cannot continue as it is. You may not know which door to open, but you have begun to recognize the door you can no longer stand behind. And that recognition matters. You do not always need an immediate answer. Sometimes the first act of courage is admitting that the question exists. Maybe you have been living according to someone else's definition of success. Maybe you have been holding on to a relationship, a career, a habit, or an identity because you are afraid of what will happen when you release it. Maybe you became so good at being who others needed that you forgot to ask who you were when nobody was watching. Restlessness can expose that forgotten self. It can become a mirror. It can show you the distance between the person you have become and the person you are still capable of becoming. This does not mean you should suddenly abandon everything. It does not mean every uncomfortable feeling demands a dramatic decision. It means you should listen before you dismiss what you feel. Sit with yourself. Pay attention to what repeatedly returns to your thoughts. Notice what gives you energy and what quietly drains you. Notice the dreams that keep appearing even after you have convinced yourself they are impossible. There may be something inside you that has been waiting patiently for your attention. And perhaps the greatest mistake you could make is calling that voice weakness, when it may actually be the part of you that still remembers what you truly need. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to remain still when you do not understand what you are feeling. We are taught to solve everything, name everything, explain everything. When sadness arrives, we search for its reason. When fear appears, we look for its source. When restlessness enters our lives, we immediately want to know what it means and what we should do about it. But not every feeling arrives with an explanation. Some feelings need time before their meaning becomes clear. You may wake up one morning carrying an uneasiness you cannot describe. Nothing terrible happened. Nobody hurt you. Nothing obvious has gone wrong. Still, your heart feels crowded. Your thoughts move in circles. You feel as though you are waiting for something, although you do not know what you are waiting for. In moments like these, your instinct may be to escape yourself. You reach for your phone, turn on music, talk to someone, become busy, or fill every empty moment with noise. But what if the silence is exactly where the answer is waiting? There is wisdom in allowing yourself to experience a feeling without immediately trying to destroy it. You do not have to judge it as good or bad. You do not have to become frightened by it. You can simply say, I feel unsettled today, and allow that truth to exist. Sometimes the mind needs quiet before it can hear what the heart has been saying. Perhaps your restlessness is connected to something you have been avoiding. Perhaps you are tired of pretending that a certain situation satisfies you. Perhaps you have been moving toward goals that no longer reflect who you are. Perhaps you have given so much of yourself to other people that you have forgotten what it feels like to belong to yourself. You may not discover these truths in one dramatic revelation. Sometimes they emerge slowly. A thought returns. A memory surfaces. A desire refuses to disappear. A certain possibility keeps appearing in your imagination. Little by little, the unnamed feeling begins to form a language. This is why patience matters. You do not have to force clarity before it is ready. A seed does not become a tree because you demand that it grow faster. Some things require darkness, stillness, and time before they reveal what they were becoming. Your inner life deserves that same patience. Give yourself permission to sit with uncertainty. Write down what you are feeling. Walk without distractions. Spend a few minutes alone. Ask yourself gentle questions rather than demanding immediate answers. What am I tired of? What am I longing for? What have I been pretending not to know? What part of myself have I neglected? Do not interrogate your heart as though it has committed a crime. Listen to it as though it is trying to guide you home. There may be no instant answer. There may only be a subtle shift, a growing awareness, a quiet recognition that something within you deserves attention. And sometimes, when you stop demanding that every feeling explain itself immediately, you create enough silence of your deepest truth to finally speak. Change rarely announces itself with certainty. More often, it arrives disguised as discomfort. You begin to feel restless in places where you once felt comfortable. You question routines that once seemed perfectly acceptable. You notice that the goals you once pursued no longer create the same excitement. And because you cannot yet see what comes next, you may assume something is wrong. But sometimes nothing is wrong. Sometimes you are simply standing at the edge of a new chapter. The difficulty is that the beginning of transformation can feel remarkably similar to confusion. Before a door opens, you may first become aware that you have been standing in front of the wrong one. Before you discover a new direction, you may experience dissatisfaction with the direction you have been following. Before you understand who you are becoming, you may feel disconnected from who you used to be. That middle place can be frightening. You are no longer completely comfortable with the old, but you are not yet familiar with the new. You cannot return to yesterday with the same heart, yet tomorrow has not introduced itself. So you stand between what was and what might be, wondering why your peace has disappeared. This is where many people turn back. They mistake uncertainty for failure. They return to familiar situations simply because familiarity feels safer than possibility. They silence their questions. They convince themselves that wanting something different is selfish or foolish. They choose the predictable pain of staying over the uncertain possibility of becoming. But growth has always required some uncertainty. You may not recognize the person you are becoming because you have not met that person fully yet. So do not demand that your next chapter make perfect sense while you are still living its first page. Allow yourself to be uncertain. Allow yourself to change your mind. Allow yourself to admit that what once satisfied you no longer does. There is dignity in recognizing that you have evolved. You are not required to remain loyal to every version of yourself you have ever been. The person who made certain choices years ago did so with the understanding, fears, hopes, and knowledge available at that time. Today, you may know more. You may see differently. You may desire differently. That is not betrayal. That is growth. The restlessness you feel may be the discomfort of leaving an old identity behind. It may be the tension created when your inner life begins moving faster than your outer circumstances. Instead of asking, "Why can't I feel settled anymore?" perhaps ask, "What is changing within me?" That question does not demand an immediate answer. It simply opens a door, and sometimes that is all transformation needs at first. The courage to remain present in the uncertainty long enough for the next part of your life to reveal itself. There is a difference between being lost and being called towards something new. Yet when restlessness enters your life, it can be difficult to tell the difference. You may believe that your inability to feel settled means you are weak, confused, or incapable of appreciating what you already have. You may look at other people who seem certain about their lives and wonder why you cannot simply be satisfied with yours. But perhaps your restlessness is not evidence of weakness at all. Perhaps it is evidence that some deeper part of you is refusing to live a life that no longer feels true. You have to understand that the human spirit does not remain unchanged. You grow, you learn, you experience loss, love, disappointment, success, failure, and moments of profound realization. Every experience leaves something behind, and sometimes, after years of becoming, you arrive at a place where the life you built no longer fits the person you have become. That can feel uncomfortable. You may still have the same job, the same responsibilities, the same relationships, and the same daily routine. But inside, something has shifted. What once seemed important may suddenly feel empty. What once seemed impossible may begin calling your name. You may begin longing for creativity, freedom, meaning, solitude, connection, or simply a life that feels more honest. Do not immediately punish yourself for that longing. A desire for something deeper does not automatically mean you are ungrateful. Wanting to grow does not mean you hate where you have been. You can appreciate your past and still recognize that it cannot be your permanent home. Sometimes the soul becomes restless because it knows you are capable of more truth, not necessarily more money, more recognition, or more achievement. More truth, the truth about what you want, the truth about what hurts, the truth about what you have tolerated, the truth about what you have sacrificed to keep everyone else comfortable. The truth about the dreams you abandoned because someone convinced you they were unrealistic. And perhaps that is why restlessness can feel so powerful. It begins pulling the curtain away. It asks you to look at your life without the excuses. It asks you to stop saying, "This is just how things are," when some part of you knows that things could be different. You do not have to change everything overnight. In fact, meaningful change rarely happens that way. Sometimes it begins with one honest conversation, one boundary, one decision, 1 hour spent pursuing something that makes you feel alive again. One moment when you choose your own voice over the expectations surrounding you. The important thing is not to fear the message, simply because you do not yet understand it. Listen. Your restlessness may be telling you that you have been asleep in certain areas of your life. It may be reminding you that you still have dreams. It may be revealing that beneath all your responsibilities, there is a person who wants to be heard. So instead of asking yourself why you cannot simply settle down, ask yourself what your spirit is trying to protect, awaken, or become. Because sometimes the discomfort you desperately want to escape is actually the inner voice reminding you that you were never meant to disappear inside a life that no longer reflects who you are. You do not need to see the entire road before you decide to take the next step. This is one of the hardest truths to accept when you are restless, uncertain, or standing at the edge of change. You want guarantees. You want to know that the decision will work, that the door will lead somewhere better, that you will not regret leaving what is familiar. You want tomorrow to explain itself before you are willing to move toward it. But life rarely offers that kind of certainty. Sometimes you are given only enough light to see the step directly in front of you. And that has to be enough. When you are experiencing restlessness, your mind may demand a complete plan. It may tell you that you cannot change anything until you know exactly what comes next. But waiting for perfect clarity can become another form of fear. You keep waiting for the moment when you'll finally feel completely ready, only to discover that readiness rarely arrives before action. You become ready by moving. This does not mean acting recklessly. It does not mean abandoning everything you know without thought. It means allowing yourself to take small, honest steps even when the destination remains unclear. Perhaps you begin by admitting what you truly want. Perhaps you start learning something you have always been curious about. Perhaps you create boundaries where you have spent years saying yes. Perhaps you give yourself permission to rest and hear your own thoughts. Perhaps you simply stop pretending that you are satisfied when you are not. Small steps matter because they create evidence that you can trust yourself. For so long, you may have depended on other people's approval to decide whether your choices were acceptable. You may have waited for someone to tell you that your dream was reasonable, your feelings were valid, or your direction was safe. But eventually there comes a moment when you must become your own witness. You must learn to hear your own voice beneath the noise. That is where trust begins. You may make mistakes. You may take a wrong turn. You may discover that something you thought you wanted is not actually what you need. But even that is part of the journey. A wrong step can teach you something that standing still never could. Do not demand perfection from yourself before allowing yourself to begin. The next chapter does not require you to know its entire story. It requires you to be present enough to write the next sentence. When you feel restless, ask yourself what one small action would move you closer to the life that feels honest. Not the action that impresses everyone. Not the action that guarantees success. The action that quietly tells yourself, "I am listening." Maybe that is enough for today. Tomorrow there may be another step, then another. And gradually, what once looked like darkness begins to look like a path. You realize that clarity was not waiting somewhere far ahead for you to discover it. Much of the clarity was created by moving, trying, learning, releasing, and beginning again. So if you cannot see the whole road, do not condemn yourself for being uncertain. Take the next step you can see. Trust that your life does not have to reveal every answer before you begin walking toward the one that matters most.